HIV is no longer the death sentence it once was. What's more, advances in retroviral treatment mean that people living with HIV can achieve a viral load that is undetectable and therefore untransmissible.
HIV fertility rights are expected to be passed into law at long last. What's your reaction to that?
I think it's really positive news. I know the HIV sector have been campaigning for this a long time. I used to work for the National AIDS Trust. I was directly involved in my previous role in calling for this change. And I think it's long overdue. It's right that the law reflects the modern realities of living with HIV. The science has changed, and it's right that the law changes too.
As we've seen, this disproportionately affects LGBTQ plus people who inherently will require access to things like fertility treatments in order to create a family. What's sort of your message to the community in terms of what this means for them and those people who have been wanting this for so many years?
Well, I remember hearing some really, heartbreaking stories of people denied access to fertility treatment, not because of the science, not because there was any risk of transmitting HIV, just because the law was outdated and not keeping up with reality. As you say, it disproportionately affected certain groups, particularly LGBT people, and it's another step forward to real equality for LGBT people and for treating people living with HIV fairly. So I think it's welcome news. There's still more to do. It's an ongoing journey, but I think it's a really positive step forward today. I know the kind of snap election kind of delayed somewhat the passing of these changes, so it's really pleasing that today we're taking that step forward.
Another big step forward we're trying to take at the moment is ending new cases by 2030. With the election of Labour, this is pretty much the last government with the hope of making that a reality. Are you confident we can end new cases in the next 6 years?
It's an imperative that we do it. It's scientifically possible. It's morally necessary to act now. We've got the tools to end new HIV transmissions in the UK. Unfortunately, the data which came out very recently in recent weeks shows that we're not on track. Actually, we're going backwards. Transmissions have increased, not decreased. And I think, there's a number of reasons for that. I think testing fell, particularly for some groups during COVID. Sexual health services are really struggling with funding over the last decade. And unfortunately, a lot of things that were talked about in the last government's HIV Action Plan haven't come to pass. We haven't got PrEP out there to everyone who needs it in community services, in pharmacies and other services. We haven't got opt-out testing everywhere it should be. We've made some positive progress in some hospitals, but not far and fast enough. So I'm really heartened. I heard Wes, the new Health Secretary, speak at Labour conference, and he was really determined about this. It's something that was in the Labour manifesto, which wouldn't have happened by accident. It was a decision to do that, to agree a new HIV Action Plan to get us to that 2030 goal. So I'm certainly heartened by that. And I'll be doing my bit as a backbench Labour MP, a member of the Health Select Committee, to make sure we do put all pressure possible on the whole health system to reach this ambition.
And in terms of a new HIV Action Plan, obviously this has been long promised by Labour. What are you hoping it actually sort of top level encompasses to ensure we can end new cases, but also not forget about the people who are still living with HIV?
Well, I think we really need to make sure that everyone possible gets access to a HIV test. There's still people living with HIV undiagnosed, not knowing they have it, not getting the treatment they need, and potentially passing HIV on. So we have to get tests out there. Test was the message of the last action plan, and it's not really come to pass. We haven't accelerated access to opt-out HIV testing across a range of services. So I really want to see more action on that. The opt-out testing pilot in London, in Manchester and Brighton was really successful. It found hundreds and hundreds of people who didn't know they had HIV just through an opt-out test when you go to hospital. So we need to roll out that approach. As I say, PrEP, amazing drug, incredibly cheap now, but far too many people, particularly people from black and minority ethnic communities, women, are not getting access to it. So I want to see PrEP outside of just sexual health services. I want to see it available in pharmacy and in other settings. And as you say, we can't forget people living with HIV. And, we have, U equals U. If you're on HIV treatment successfully, you can't pass it on, which is an amazing, amazing advance in medicine and liberating for those people. But we still have a lot of people who are diagnosed, which are not accessing treatment, who've fallen out of the system. And so we need to ensure there's proper support for people to get them back into care, properly supported and on successful HIV treatment.
Yeah, and you mentioned there U equals U. I think as someone that's worked in the HIV sector, you'll be well aware that now we're in a position where the stigma is pretty much worse than the actual virus itself. How would you like to see Labour tackle the stigma that still exists in the UK against people who are living with HIV?
Well, I think some of the changes to the law that are going through today, a part of that, are really rooting out from our law, from our society, these kind of outdated regulations. We've had previously rules about people serving in the armed forces and the military, really getting rid of those stigmatising laws and practices. I think is a start, treating HIV as what it is, which is just a treatable long-term health condition like diabetes, a number of other conditions which people may develop and get, and people need access to the right treatment, care and support. So I kind of really want to see that message come out from our policymakers, decision makers. I think it's also beholden on people like me, members of Parliament, to be really talking about this subject, supporting people living with HIV to share their experience as well. And unfortunately, stigma, as you say, does persist, and it is ultimately preventing people testing for HIV because they'd rather not know, from taking PrEP because they don't want people in their families to see them taking PrEP in case they think it's HIV medication, and from staying in care and accessing treatment. So we really need to kind of continue that, continue to support the HIV sector as well, to campaign and share their amazing, really life-changing messages about U equals U.
Absolutely, and we're seeing at the moment cases in heterosexual people surge a lot faster actually than in gay and bisexual and other men who have sex with men, who in the past have been the group that have seen the fastest increase. How would you like to see that messaging reach those other groups of people?
No, you're definitely right. Wherever it's access to HIV testing, that has recovered to pre-COVID levels for gay, bisexual men, but it hasn't for heterosexuals and for ethnic minority communities. Access to PrEP is predominantly white, gay, urban men who are accessing PrEP, which is great for them and has led to significant falls in HIV transmissions, but not other groups. So, it's partly going back to not exceptionalising HIV, not expecting people to have to ask for a test or have to ask about PrEP. Putting the agency on the person is actually about mainstreaming HIV treatment and prevention across the health system where everyone accesses health and care. So, in women's health services, maternity services, reproductive health services, I want to be seeing PrEP and HIV testing in those places where women are accessing care regularly. In community settings, supporting community groups, religious, cultural groups, to be going out there with these messages about PrEP and about HIV testing and being able to provide those. At the moment, HIV testing, HIV prevention like PrEP is really kind of owned by a really small part of the health system, sexual health. And we know that lots of people don't access those services, find them quite stigmatising to access those services, and don't think necessarily that HIV is something that affects people like them. And as you say, that isn't the case. And we need to make access much more widestream across the health system.
And then on LGBTQ plus rights more generally, what's the main thing that you would like to see Labour achieve by the end of their first term in government in terms of equality for the community as a whole?
I think today's decision is a real significant milestone and step forward. I think there's still, unfortunately, we know lots of cases of employment discrimination. Sometimes, we've got amazing pieces of legislation, the Equality Act, and other legislation. It's often the implementation of those which is still a problem. So I'd like to see people have much better access to justice. I'd like to see it, be easier for people to, for example, access tribunals and legal advice to really ensure that those rights that do exist are actually accessible to people, which I think is an outstanding challenge. And I think, as you said, around stigma, I think, again, we know that lots of people now have the rights to be in professions, have the rights to challenge unfair treatment discrimination. But again, because of the ongoing stigma about HIV, they're kind of reluctant to. So I do think, back to your question, tackling stigma is vital so people's legal rights are lived and accessible.
And then lastly, just on the budget, we've got figures as high as the Deputy Prime Minister concerned about budget cuts. Do you share those concerns?
I think, we've seen sexual health services and health services face real funding constraints over the last 14 years of Conservative government. I think we need to do all that we possibly can to protect the NHS and health services and other vital social services. I think it's really pleasing we've seen the government say there won't be a return to austerity, and that's right. We need to balance the books, but we need to fundamentally do it in a way that protects core public services and also deliver the growth we need to be able to invest more in our public services.